Welcome, friend, to this peaceful hour where we gently peel back the layers of time. Tonight, our story takes place in a world far removed from ours, but still tenderly human. Whether you're drifting off or just looking to slow the pace of your evening, I'm grateful you're here. I'd love to hear where you're listening from, what city or country, and what time it is as you press play. It always amazes me how history can bring strangers together. If this kind of calm, historical storytelling brings you peace, consider subscribing. We have many more stories to lull us into the quiet night. This isn't some fictional scene from a movie. This was reality in the bohemian cafes of 1920s Paris, where artistic genius and narcotic addiction danced together in a deadly waltz that would forever change the cultural landscape of the modern world. Have you ever wondered how an entire generation of artists could simultaneously create some of humanity's most brilliant works while slowly destroying themselves with drugs? The answer lies in the shadowy corners of Parisian cafes, where absinthe flowed like water and heroin was as common as coffee. What I'm about to reveal will shatter everything you thought you knew about the romantic notion of the struggling artist. These weren't just creative souls seeking inspiration through chemical means. They were casualties of a perfect storm of post-war trauma, cultural rebellion, and readily available narcotics that turned the City of Light into something far more sinister. Today, I'm going to take you inside the hidden world of heroin havens that masqueraded as artistic sanctuaries. You'll meet the real people who lived this nightmare, discover how entire cafe cultures became drug distribution networks, and understand why the most creative period in Parisian history was also its most self-destructive. By the end of this journey, you'll see the 1920s art scene in a completely different light. But before we dive into the smoke-filled rooms where dreams went to die, let me paint you the bigger picture of how Paris became the epicenter of both artistic revolution and narcotic devastation. The Great War had ended just a few years earlier, leaving an entire generation scarred and searching for meaning. Young men who had witnessed unimaginable horrors in the trenches returned home only to find that their old lives no longer fit. Meanwhile, a new breed of wealthy Americans was flooding into Paris, escaping prohibition and bringing with them both money and a reckless appetite for excess. This collision of trauma, wealth, and rebellion created the perfect conditions for what would become one of history's most dangerous cultural experiments. The cafes of Mom and Menace weren't just serving coffee and croissants. They were dealing in something far more intoxicating and infinitely more destructive. Let me introduce you to Jean-Baptiste Marot, a 24-year-old painter who arrived in Paris in the spring of 1923 with nothing but a battered suitcase and dreams of becoming the next Picasso. Jean-Baptiste had survived Verdun, but the nightmares followed him to his cramped studio apartment near Sacreux. Sleep became impossible, so he began frequenting Café de l'Amour, a notorious establishment where the coffee was bitter. And the real business happened after midnight. It was here that Jean-Baptiste first encountered the needle, not as a medical instrument, but as a gateway to a world where the screaming in his head finally stopped. The cafe's owner, a mysterious woman known only as Madame Noire, had connections that ran deeper than anyone suspected. She didn't just serve drinks, she served escape. Within weeks, Jean-Baptiste's artistic output exploded. His paintings took on an otherworldly quality, full of dreamlike imagery and emotional intensity that critics would later call revolutionary. But what they didn't know was that each masterpiece was paid for with a piece of his soul, bought with German-manufactured heroin that flowed through the café like a toxic river. Jean-Baptiste wasn't alone. The café attracted a rotating cast of damaged souls, American aces running from conservative families, British poets seeking inspiration, German intellectuals fleeing political upheaval, and French artists trying to forget the war. They came for the atmosphere, but stayed for the drugs. Madame Noire understood something that modern drug dealers still exploit today. Creative people make excellent customers. They have just enough money to maintain a habit. They're naturally inclined toward experimentation, and they rationalize their addiction as necessary for their art. She didn't need to push her product. She simply created an environment where it felt inevitable. The cafe operated on multiple levels. To the casual observer, it was simply another bohemian gathering place where artists discussed philosophy over wine. But if you knew the right words, the right gestures, the right people, you could access a parallel world where heroin was measured in artistic inspiration rather than grams. Regular customers developed an elaborate code. Ordering the special coffee meant you wanted opium. Asking for sugar with extra sweetness was code for cocaine. But heroin, the most sought-after substance, required the most subtle approach. You simply asked if the painter supplies were available today. The irony wasn't lost on anyone involved. These were people who saw themselves as rebels against bourgeois society. Yet they were creating their own rigid hierarchy based on drug access and artistic credibility. The deeper into addiction you fell, the more authentic your art was considered. Sobriety became synonymous with selling out. Take the case of Margaret Worthington, a Boston socialite who arrived in Paris in 1924 with a substantial trust fund and romantic notions about supporting struggling artists. She rented a spacious apartment in the 6th arrondissement and began hosting salons where she would showcase the work of promising young painters and writers. Margaret initially saw herself as a patron of the arts, a modern-day Medi, nurturing the next generation of creative genius. She attended gallery openings, purchased paintings from unknown artists, and prided herself on her sophisticated taste. But sophistication in 1920s Paris meant more than just appreciating cubism or understanding stream-of-consciousness literature. When Margaret first visited Café Del Mor, she was introduced to a world where artistic appreciation took on physical dimensions. The paintings on the walls weren't just viewed. They were experienced through chemical enhancement that allegedly allowed deeper understanding of the artist's vision. The poetry readings weren't just listened to, they were felt through substances that supposedly open the mind to new forms of consciousness. Margaret's transformation was gradual but devastating. She began by occasionally sampling opium during evening salons, telling herself it was research into the artistic process. Within months, she had graduated to heroin. Convinced that only through personal experience with the drug could she truly understand the art it inspired, her apartment became another node in the network of heroin distribution. Artists would arrive ostensibly to show their work, but actually to score drugs. Margaret would purchase their paintings, not because she loved them, but because buying art was how transactions were disguised. A canvas that might be worth 50 francs would sell for 500, with the markup covering the cost of heroin. The genius of this system was its deniability. If questioned by authorities, everyone involved could claim they were simply participating in the legitimate art market. The drugs were incidental, they would argue, just part of the creative atmosphere that made such groundbreaking art possible. But the reality was far darker. Margaret's trust fund was being systematically drained to feed not just her own addiction, but the habits of an entire network of artists and dealers. Her health deteriorated rapidly. Her judgment became compromised, and her apartment transformed from a salon into a shooting gallery, disguised as a gallery space. The most tragic aspect was how the addiction affected the art itself. While initial drug use might have enhanced creativity for some artists, prolonged heroin addiction had the opposite effect. The very inspiration that drew artists to the drug eventually disappeared, leaving them creating art solely to fund their next fix. Jean-Baptiste's story illustrates this perfectly. His early heroin-influenced paintings were indeed revolutionary, full of emotional complexity and visual innovation that captured the attention of serious collectors. But as his addiction deepened, his work became increasingly formulaic. He found himself painting the same dreamlike imagery over and over, not because it expressed his artistic vision, but because those were the only paintings that sold to the drug-using collectors who frequented the cafes. The economic ecosystem was entirely circular and ultimately unsustainable. Artists used drugs to create art, sold art to buy drugs, and attracted buyers who were themselves using drugs to appreciate art. Money flowed in endless loops, but actual value was being destroyed at every step. The art became less innovative, the artists became less capable, and the buyers became less discerning. Meanwhile, Madame Noire and others like her were getting rich by facilitating this destruction. They positioned themselves as cultural facilitators, but they were actually running sophisticated drug operations that used artistic pretension as cover. The cafe provided the perfect front. Irregular hours, eclectic clientele, and a culture that celebrated nonconformity made it nearly impossible for authorities to distinguish between legitimate artistic activity and criminal enterprise. The international nature of the clientele also provided protection. When wealthy Americans or British aristocrats were involved, local police were reluctant to investigate too aggressively. Diplomatic complaints could end careers, and there was always plausible deniability about what was really happening in these establishments. This created a sense of invulnerability among the participants that would prove tragically misplaced. They believed their artistic credentials and social connections made them untouchable, failing to recognize that addiction doesn't respect class boundaries or creative talent. By 1925, the network had expanded far beyond individual cafes. What started as scattered pockets of artistic experimentation had evolved into a sophisticated underground economy that stretched across the entire left bank. The heroin trade had found its perfect camouflage in the bohemian cafe culture, and the results were both magnificent and horrifying. Consider the evening routine at La Chiani Fume, a cafe that occupied 3 floors of a crumbling building near the Sorbonne. The ground floor maintained the appearance of respectability. Students debated philosophy over cheap wine. Tourists sampled authentic French atmosphere, and local intellectuals held court at their regular tables. But as the night progressed and the casual customers departed, the real business began. The second floor, accessible only through a narrow staircase hidden behind a bookshelf, housed what regulars called the laboratory. Here, American expatriate chemist-turned-dealer Robert "Bobby" Chen had set up an operation that would make modern drug cartels envious. Bobby had arrived in Paris with legitimate credentials, a chemistry degree from Harvard, and plans to conduct research at the Seon. Instead, he found himself cooking heroin in makeshift labs, using his scientific training to create increasingly pure and potent products. Bobby's customers weren't street addicts desperate for their next fix. They were discerning consumers who demanded quality and consistency. A batch that was too weak would send artists into withdrawal during crucial creative periods. Too strong and valuable customers might overdose before completing commissioned works. Bobby approached drug manufacturing with the same precision he had once applied to legitimate research, keeping detailed notes on potency levels, customer reactions, and optimal dosing schedules. The third floor of Lachien served as both gallery and shooting gallery. Paintings hung on walls that had seen countless injections, their colors seeming to shift and dance in the dim gaslight. Artists would arrive with their latest works, hoping to trade canvas for powder. The quality of the art directly determined the quantity of drugs received, creating a perverse market where artistic merit was measured in milligs of heroin. This system attracted some genuinely talented individuals who might have achieved greatness without chemical assistance. Elise Joubois, a sculptor from Lyon, possessed extraordinary natural ability that had earned her recognition at legitimate galleries across Europe. But the war had killed her fiancé and shattered her faith in traditional values. She came to Paris seeking not fame, but forgetfulness. Eliza's sculptures, created under the influence of heroin, took on qualities that defied conventional artistic categories. Working with clay in a near-trance state, she would spend 18 hours straight shaping figures that seemed to emerge from some collective unconscious. Her pieces captured emotions that viewers couldn't name, but immediately recognized. The specific grief of losing someone to senseless violence, the hollow exhaustion of surviving when others hadn't, the desperate hunger for meaning in a world that had revealed its fundamental chaos. Gallery owners noticed Elise's work immediately. Her sculptures sold for unprecedented sums to collectors who claimed they could feel the artist's pain radiating from the clay itself. What these buyers didn't realize was that they were literally purchasing someone else's suffering, commodified and transformed into aesthetic experience through the medium of narcotic addiction. Elise's success created its own trap. Each sculpture required deeper states of heroin-induced dissociation to access the emotional rawness that made her work so compelling. She found herself increasing her doses not for pleasure, but for artistic necessity. The drug had become as essential to her creative process as clay or water. Without it, her hands would shake too violently to shape anything. With too much, her consciousness would slip away entirely, leaving her staring at shapeless lumps of clay with no memory of the previous hours. The tragedy was that Elisa's addiction coincided with what should have been the peak of her artistic powers. At 28, she possessed both the technical skill and emotional depth necessary for masterpiece creation. Instead, she was trapped in a cycle where each artistic triumph required a level of drug use that made the next triumph less likely. Meanwhile, the financial mechanics of the Heroin Café network were becoming increasingly sophisticated. Transactions were rarely conducted with simple cash exchanges. Instead, an elaborate barter system had emerged where art, drugs, sex, and social connections were traded in complex multi-party arrangements that made tracking nearly impossible. A typical transaction might involve an American heiress purchasing a painting for an inflated price with the excess money used to buy heroin that would be shared with the artist and several intermediaries. The heiress would gain social credibility by supporting avant-garde art. The artists would fund both addiction and basic living expenses, and the dealers would profit while maintaining plausible deniability about their actual business. These arrangements were facilitated by figures like Henry Lost, a former banker who had discovered that his financial expertise was perfectly suited to managing drug distribution networks. Henry never touched heroin himself, viewing addiction as bad business practice, but he understood how to structure transactions that satisfied everyone's needs while minimizing legal exposure. Henry operated from Café des Rêves Perdus, where he held court every evening from 10 until dawn. Artists would approach his table with their latest works, hoping to secure advances against future drug purchases. Henry would evaluate not just the artistic merit of their pieces, but their potential for continued productivity. An artist showing signs of severe addiction might be cut off, not out of moral concern, but because investing in someone approaching complete physical collapse was financially unsound. This cold calculation extended to every aspect of Henry's operation. He maintained detailed records of customer reliability, tracking which artists could be trusted to deliver promised works and which were likely to disappear into heroin-induced oblivion. He monitored market trends in both legitimate art sales and street drug prices, adjusting his own pricing accordingly. Most importantly, he cultivated relationships with corrupt officials who could provide advanced warning of police raids or regulatory changes. Henry's success attracted imitators throughout the Latin Quarter. By 1926, at least a dozen cafes were operating similar schemes, each with its own specialty and clientele. Café Noir focused on serving wealthy tourists seeking authentic bohemian experiences. Laura Blanc catered to established artists who could afford higher quality drugs. Schiffer specialized in opium for customers who preferred that drug's more languid effects. Competition between these establishments sometimes turned violent. When Café Desert Modi began offering higher purity heroin at lower prices, threatening HR's market share, a mysterious fire destroyed their kitchen and forced them to close for months. When Litim Moore started recruiting HR's best customers with promises of exotic new drug combinations, several of their regular patrons suffered near-fatal overdoses that scared away other potential clients. The violence was usually subtle, disguised as accidents or coincidences, but participants understood the message. The Heroin Café network had become too profitable and too well established to tolerate significant disruption. Anyone threatening the system would face consequences that extended far beyond simple business competition. This atmosphere of barely controlled chaos attracted a particular type of personality. People drawn to the heroin cafes weren't just seeking drugs or art, they were seeking danger itself. The possibility of overdose, arrest, financial ruin, or violent retaliation added an element of excitement that made the experience more compelling than simple drug use or artistic appreciation alone. American expatriate writer Jonathan Hayes embodied this attraction to risk. Hayes had inherited substantial wealth, but found conventional life unbearably boring. He came to Paris not to write the great American novel, but to live dangerously enough that he would have something worth writing about. The heroin cafes provided exactly the kind of authentic peril he craved. Hayes began frequenting Café de la, where he quickly established himself as someone willing to take risks that frightened even seasoned addicts. He would inject unknown substances, participate in dangerous drug combinations, and involve himself in increasingly volatile business arrangements between dealers and artists. His writing, produced in brief periods of clarity between binges, captured the authentic texture of addiction with a precision that made his work essential reading for anyone seeking to understand the period. But Hayes's appetite for danger eventually exceeded even his considerable resources. He became involved in a scheme to smuggle heroin from Germany using hollow picture frames, a plan that required him to transport drugs across international borders while maintaining his cover as a legitimate art collector. The profits would have been enormous, but the risks included not just imprisonment, but execution if caught by authorities who were becoming increasingly aggressive about international drug trafficking. Hayes' story illustrates how the heroin cafe culture had evolved beyond simple addiction or artistic experimentation. By the mid-1920s, it had become a complex ecosystem where people used drugs, art, and danger as interchangeable currencies in transactions that satisfied needs far more complicated than simple chemical dependency. The most sophisticated participants understood that they weren't just buying drugs or selling art. They were purchasing experiences that couldn't be obtained through conventional means. The thrill of transgression, the intimacy of shared secrets, the satisfaction of belonging to an exclusive community that operated by its own rules. The heroin was often less important than the ritual surrounding its use, the social connections it facilitated, and the identity it provided to people who felt disconnected from mainstream society. This psychological dimension made the cafe network far more addictive than the drugs themselves. People who successfully overcame their chemical dependencies often found themselves unable to stay away from the social environment where those dependencies had flourished. The cafes offered not just heroin, but a complete alternative reality where conventional morality, social expectations, and economic relationships were suspended in favor of more immediate and intense forms of human connection. The tragedy was that this alternative reality was ultimately unsustainable. The financial arrangements were too complex, the legal risks too high, and the physical toll too severe for the system to continue indefinitely. By 1927, cracks were beginning to show throughout the network as overdoses increased. Money ran out, and authorities began to take notice of what was happening in the supposedly innocent artistic cafes of the left bank. The first major crack appeared in the form of Detective Inspector Claude Bertrand, a methodical man who had spent 20 years building cases against Paris's most elusive criminals. Bertrand wasn't particularly interested in artistic movements or bohemian culture, but he was very interested in the sudden spike in overdose deaths among wealthy foreigners. When the American embassy began pressuring French authorities to investigate the deaths of 3 expatriate heiresses within a single month, Bertrand found himself assigned to a case that would consume the next 2 years of his life. Bertrand's initial investigation revealed what appeared to be a series of tragic coincidences. Young, wealthy individuals with artistic interests were dying from what seemed to be accidental drug overdoses. The deaths occurred in different locations, involved different substances, and appeared to have no connection beyond the victims' shared interest in avant-garde culture. But Bertrand had learned to distrust coincidences, especially when they involved large sums of money and international borders. His breakthrough came through the most unlikely source, a 70-year-old concierge named Madame Paty, who worked at a residential hotel near the Panthéon. Madame Paty had been cleaning rooms and watching tenants for 5 decades, developing an almost supernatural ability to detect when something was amiss. She approached Bertrand with concerns about one of her long-term residents, a young German artist named Klaus Weber, who had been living at the hotel for 18 months. Klaus had initially impressed Madame Paty as a serious, dedicated artist who paid his rent promptly and kept his studio space meticulously clean. But over the past 6 months, his behavior had changed dramatically. He would disappear for days at a time, return looking haggarded and disoriented, then spend entire weeks locked in his room with visitors coming and going at all hours. The visitors were always well-dressed, often foreign, and they carried packages that seemed too valuable for legitimate art supplies. When Bertrand examined Klaus's hotel registration, he discovered discrepancies that suggested false documentation. Further investigation revealed that Klaus Weber was actually Wilhelm Richter, a former German army medic who had deserted during the final months of the war. Wilhelm possessed medical knowledge that made him valuable to the heroin distribution network, but his illegal status in France made him vulnerable to blackmail and coercion. Bertrand approached Wilhelm carefully, recognizing that fear, rather than greed, was likely motivating his involvement in the drug trade. During a series of clandestine meetings in small cafes far from the artistic quarter, Wilhelm gradually revealed the structure and scope of what he called the machine, a distribution network that used artistic culture as both camouflage and customer base. Wilhelm's medical training had made him indispensable to dealers who needed someone capable of treating overdoses without involving legitimate doctors. He had learned to revive unconscious addicts, manage withdrawal symptoms, and even perform minor surgery on customers who had suffered injuries during drug-related accidents. His services were paid for not with money, but with protection from authorities who might investigate his immigration status. Through Wilhelm's testimony, Bertrand began to understand how the cafe network operated as an integrated system rather than a collection of independent establishments. Each cafe specialized in serving different segments of the market: wealthy tourists, established artists, young bohemians, and international dealers. But they all shared suppliers, enforcement mechanisms, and money laundering operations that made the entire network more resilient than any individual component. The key insight was that legitimate art sales were being used to disguise drug transactions on an industrial scale. A painting that might legitimately sell for 100 francs could be purchased for 1,000 francs, with the extra 900 francs representing payment for heroin. The buyer received both artwork and drugs. The seller received both money and social credibility as a successful artist, and the dealer received a commission that was nearly impossible for authorities to trace. This system had created artificial inflation in the Parisian art market that was distorting cultural values throughout the city. Young artists found themselves unable to sell work through legitimate channels because collectors were primarily interested in drug-facilitated transactions. Established artists watch their market values fluctuate based not on artistic merit, but on their willingness to participate in narcotic distribution. Gallery owners face pressure to either join the network or lose access to the most financially attractive customers. Bertrand's investigation revealed that the corruption extended far beyond artistic circles. Bank officials were facilitating international money transfers that funded drug purchases. Shipping companies were transporting heroin concealed in legitimate art shipments. Even some embassy staff were involved using diplomatic immunity to move drugs and money across borders without customs inspection. The scope of the conspiracy was so vast that Bertrand initially doubted his own findings. How could such an extensive criminal operation exist in plain sight without attracting official attention? The answer lay in the social status of the participants and the cultural prestige associated with supporting avant-garde art. Police were reluctant to investigate activities that involved prominent citizens engaged in what appeared to be sophisticated cultural patronage. Meanwhile, the human cost of the network was becoming impossible to ignore. The overdose death that finally triggered serious official action involved Constance Fairfax, daughter of a British Member of Parliament and heir to a shipping fortune. Constance had arrived in Paris 6 months earlier with plans to study at the Seion and support promising young artists. Her body was discovered in a studio apartment in Mana, surrounded by paintings she had purchased for prices that investigation revealed were 10 times their legitimate market value. Constance's death was particularly tragic because she had been attempting to leave the Heroin Café scene when she overdosed. Letters found in her apartment revealed her growing awareness that she was being manipulated by dealers who viewed her wealth as a resource to be systematically extracted. She had begun refusing to purchase overpriced artwork and had cut off financial support to several artists whose primary talents seemed to be consuming expensive drugs. Her final letter, addressed to her father but never sent, described her realization that the bohemian culture she had admired from afar was actually a sophisticated trap designed to separate wealthy young people from their money. She wrote about artists who created mediocre work but commanded high prices because they could provide access to heroin. Dealers who posed as cultural sophisticates while running criminal enterprises, and cafe owners who facilitated the destruction of everyone who entered their establishments. But Constance's attempt to extract herself from the network had made her dangerous to people whose livelihoods depended on maintaining the system's secrecy. Her overdose occurred just days before she was scheduled to return to London, where she planned to warn other wealthy families about the dangers their children faced in Parisian artistic circles. The timing suggested that her death might not have been accidental, though proving deliberate murder would require evidence that Bertrand was struggling to obtain. The investigation of Constance's death revealed the network's most sinister aspect: systematic targeting of vulnerable wealthy individuals who could be manipulated into funding the entire operation. Dealers had developed sophisticated profiles of ideal customers, focusing on people who possessed substantial financial resources but lacked emotional stability or strong family connections that might interfere with exploitation. Young people recovering from war trauma were particularly valuable targets. Their psychological wounds made them susceptible to addiction, while their social status provided protection from law enforcement. Dealers would identify promising prospects through network of informants in hospitals, universities, and social clubs, then orchestrate seemingly accidental encounters in artistic venues where initial drug experimentation could be presented as sophisticated cultural exploration. The process was gradual and carefully managed. A wealthy young person might spend months attending cafe events, purchasing reasonably priced artwork, and developing relationships with artists and intellectuals before being introduced to drugs. By the time chemical dependency developed, they were already emotionally invested in the community that supplied their addiction. Leaving meant abandoning not just drugs, but their entire social identity and support network. This psychological manipulation was more effective than simple coercion because it created willing participants who defended the system even as it destroyed them. Artists genuinely believed they were creating revolutionary work. Buyers convinced themselves they were supporting important cultural movements, and dealers maintained that they were facilitating artistic innovation rather than running criminal enterprises. The self-deception was reinforced by the undeniable fact that some genuinely important art was being created within the network. Several artists whose work was later recognized as historically significant had indeed produced their best pieces while using heroin obtained through cafe connections. This created enough legitimate artistic achievement to provide credible cover for the broader criminal enterprise. Vincent Maroro, Jean-Baptiste's younger brother, exemplified this tragic complexity. Vincent had followed Jean-Baptiste to Paris in 1925, hoping to pursue his own artistic ambitions while helping his brother recover from what their family believed was simple war-related drinking problem. Vincent discovered that Jean-Baptiste's issues extended far beyond alcohol, but he also witnessed his brother creating paintings of extraordinary emotional power and technical innovation. Vincent found himself torn between concern for Jean-Baptiste's health and admiration for his artistic output. The heroin was clearly destroying his brother's body and mind, but it was also unlocking creative capabilities that seemed impossible to achieve through conventional means. Jean-Baptiste's heroin-influenced paintings were selling to serious collectors and receiving attention from legitimate critics who had no knowledge of the drugs involved in their creation. This dilemma drove Vincent to begin his own experimentation with heroin, initially as research into his brother's creative process, but eventually as an end in itself. Vincent's artistic abilities were less developed than Jean-Baptiste's, but heroin provided access to emotional states and visual perceptions that enhanced his work beyond his natural capabilities. Within months, both brothers were trapped in a cycle where artistic identity and chemical dependency had become inseparable. Their story illustrates how the cafe network corrupted not just individuals, but entire families and social connections. People who arrived in Paris with intentions of helping addicted relatives often became addicts themselves, drawn into a community where drug use was normalized and even celebrated as evidence of artistic authenticity. The economic pressures made escape nearly impossible. Artists who tried to quit heroin discovered that their work produced during sobriety was unmarketable to the collectors who had previously supported them. Gallery owners lost interest in clean artists whose work lacked the intensity that drug use had provided. Social connections evaporated as former friends viewed sobriety as betrayal of shared values and experiences. By late 1927, the network had reached a level of integration and sophistication that made it almost indistinguishable from legitimate cultural institutions. Several cafes had expanded into full-scale galleries that mounted serious exhibitions featuring work by both addicted and clean artists. Art critics, who were unaware of the drug connections, wrote favorable reviews that enhanced the reputation of network-affiliated artists in mainstream cultural circles. The most successful participants had learned to navigate between legitimate and criminal aspects of the art world, using their network connections to advance conventional careers while maintaining access to drugs and the social community that provided them. Some artists were simultaneously represented by respectable galleries and cafe-based dealers, selling different types of work to different markets depending on whether drugs were involved in the transaction. This dual existence required constant management of multiple identities and relationships. An artist might spend morning hours creating conventional work for legitimate galleries, afternoon hours producing drug-influenced pieces for cafe buyers, and evening hours socializing with other addicts while maintaining the pretense that their gatherings were purely intellectual or artistic in nature. The psychological strain of maintaining these multiple identities often accelerated the descent into deeper addiction. People who might have maintained moderate drug use for years found themselves increasing consumption to manage the anxiety and exhaustion that came from constantly switching between different versions of themselves. Meanwhile, the financial mechanics of the network were becoming so complex that even sophisticated participants lost track of their actual economic situation. Artists might believe they were financially successful based on high prices for their work, without realizing that most of their income was immediately recycled back to drug dealers. Buyers might spend enormous sums thinking they were building valuable art collections, without understanding that the inflated prices made their purchases worthless. In legitimate markets, the cafe owners and dealers who controlled the system were the only participants with clear understanding of the actual money flows. They had structured transactions to maximize their own profits while creating illusions of prosperity for everyone else involved. Artists received enough money to maintain their addictions and basic living expenses, but not enough to achieve actual financial independence that might allow them to leave the network. Buyers received enough social status and access to exclusive experiences to justify their expenditures, but not enough genuine artistic value to make their purchases worthwhile investments. The system was designed to keep everyone dependent on continued participation with no clear exit strategy for anyone except the dealers themselves. This economic trap was reinforced by social and psychological dependencies that made leaving the network feel impossible even for people who recognized its destructive nature. The cafe community provided not just drugs and art, but friendship, intellectual stimulation, sexual opportunities, and social identity that participants couldn't easily replace through conventional means. For many people involved, the network had become their entire world. Their friends were other participants. Their romantic relationships were formed within the community. Their living situations were arranged through network connections, and their daily routines revolved around cafe schedules and drug availability. Leaving meant abandoning not just addiction, but every meaningful relationship and social connection they had developed in Paris. The isolation was particularly severe for foreign participants, who had few connections outside the artistic community. American expatriates, who had burned bridges with their families to pursue bohemian lifestyles, found themselves trapped in Paris with no support system beyond the network that was destroying them. British aristocrats who had scandalized their social circles by embracing avant-garde culture couldn't return home without admitting the extent of their involvement in activities that would disgrace their families. As 1928 approached, the network was approaching a crisis that would ultimately lead to its destruction. The combination of increased police attention, mounting overdose deaths, and financial unsustainability was creating pressures that the system couldn't absorb indefinitely. But the participants were so deeply embedded in the network's social and economic structures that recognizing the approaching collapse required a level of clarity that chronic drug use made nearly impossible to achieve. The stage was set for a dramatic confrontation between the forces trying to preserve the network and those working to destroy it. With the lives and artistic legacies of hundreds of people hanging in the balance, the crisis began with a single photograph that would change everything. In February 1928, a freelance journalist named Paul Durand stumbled into Café des Rêves Perdus at 3 in the morning, seeking shelter from a violent rainstorm. What he witnessed in that smoke-filled room would expose the dark heart of Parisian bohemian culture to the world. Durand had his camera with him, a compact Leica that he used for documenting street scenes and architectural details. But the scene that greeted him in the cafe's upper room was unlike anything he had ever encountered. In the corner, a young woman in an expensive silk dress lay unconscious while a man in a painter's smock injected something into her arm. At a nearby table, 3 people passed around a needle like it was a communion chalice, their eyes rolled back in chemical ecstasy. The most shocking sight was a teenage boy, no more than 16, methodically preparing heroin, while an older man watched approvingly. The boy's hands moved with the practiced precision of someone who had performed this ritual countless times before. His clothes were expensive, suggesting wealthy family connections, but his face bore the hollow expression of advanced addiction. Durand raised his camera almost instinctively, the flash illuminating the scene for a split second before chaos erupted. Shouts filled the room as people scrambled to hide evidence and escape through back exits. But it was too late. Durand had captured something that would bring down an empire built on artistic pretension and chemical dependency. The photograph showed more than just drug use. It revealed the systematic exploitation of vulnerable young people by adults who had weaponized artistic culture for criminal purposes. The boy in the image was later identified as Philippe Rothschild, heir to a banking fortune and son of one of France's most prominent families. His presence in the cafe raised questions that would reverberate through the highest levels of French society. Philippe's story embodied everything tragic about the network's evolution. He had arrived in Paris the previous autumn, ostensibly to study literature at the Scion, but actually to escape a family scandal involving financial irregularities at his father's bank. The 16-year-old possessed both enormous wealth and profound emotional vulnerability, making him an ideal target for the cafe operators who specialized in identifying and exploiting such individuals. His recruitment had followed the established pattern. Initial contact came through seemingly innocent cultural events, where he met charming artists and intellectuals who appeared genuinely interested in his thoughts about literature and philosophy. These new friends gradually introduced him to increasingly exclusive gatherings, where drug use was presented as sophisticated exploration of consciousness rather than simple addiction. Philip's youth made him particularly susceptible to peer pressure and adult manipulation. The older artists and writers who surrounded him possessed knowledge and experience that he desperately wanted to acquire. When they suggested that true artistic understanding required direct experience with mind-altering substances, he accepted their guidance without question. His financial resources made him valuable beyond his potential. As a simple customer, Philippe had access to banking connections that could facilitate international money transfers, family properties that could serve as storage locations, and social connections that provided entry to circles previously inaccessible to the network. Within months, he had become not just an addict, but an active participant in the criminal enterprise that fed his addiction. The photograph's publication in Il Figaro created a sensation that extended far beyond artistic circles. Philippe's family immediately hired private investigators to determine how their son had become involved in such activities. Other wealthy families began questioning their own children's involvement in Parisian bohemian culture. Embassy officials demanded explanations for the apparent targeting of their citizens by French criminals. Most damaging was the revelation that the network had been systematically exploiting minors. Philippe was not the only underage participant. Investigation revealed at least a dozen other teenagers from prominent families who had been drawn into cafe-based drug operations. The exploitation of children transformed what had been viewed as adult vice into something far more serious in the eyes of both law enforcement and public opinion. Detective Inspector Bertrand found himself at the center of an international incident as foreign governments demanded action against what they characterized as organized predation on their citizens' children. The pressure forced French authorities to abandon their previous reluctance to investigate activities involving prominent cultural figures. Resources that had been denied to Bertrand's investigation were suddenly made available, along with diplomatic support for actions that might offend influential people. The investigation scope expanded dramatically as Bertrand gained access to banking records, shipping manifests, and diplomatic correspondence that revealed the true extent of the network's operations. What had appeared to be a collection of bohemian cafes was actually a sophisticated international criminal organization that used artistic culture as camouflage for drug trafficking, money laundering, and systematic fraud. The financial analysis was particularly revealing. Over the previous 3 years, approximately 2 million francs had flowed through network-affiliated accounts, representing far more money than could be explained by legitimate art sales. Much of this money had come from wealthy young people like Philippe, whose trust funds and family allowances had been systematically drained to support operations that extended far beyond Paris. Shipping records revealed regular deliveries of art supplies from Germany, Austria, and Switzerland that actually contained pharmaceutical-grade heroin and cocaine. These shipments were coordinated with the arrival of wealthy tourists and expatriates whose spending patterns had been carefully monitored by network operatives embedded in hotels, banks, and social clubs throughout the city. The most shocking discovery was the extent to which legitimate cultural institutions had been compromised by network activities. Several respected galleries were discovered to have been facilitating drug transactions through art sales. Museum curators had been accepting bribes to provide authentication for works whose values were artificially inflated to disguise drug payments. Even some art critics had been paid to write favorable reviews of network-affiliated artists, creating false reputations that supported the entire criminal enterprise. The corruption extended to law enforcement itself. Bertrand's investigation revealed that several police officials had been receiving payments to ignore network activities or provide advanced warning of planned raids. This explained how the cafes had operated openly for years, without significant interference from authorities who were supposedly monitoring criminal activity in their jurisdictions. The revelation of police corruption created a crisis within the prefecture that threatened to destabilize law enforcement throughout Paris. Officials who had been compromised faced not only criminal charges, but complete destruction of their careers and reputations. Some chose suicide rather than face the consequences of their involvement in activities that had facilitated the exploitation of children and the corruption of cultural institutions. Meanwhile, network participants were beginning to realize that their world was collapsing around them. The publication of Durand's photograph had made continued operations impossible, but many people involved were too addicted to drugs or too financially dependent on the system to simply walk away. Desperate attempts to maintain operations only accelerated the network's destruction, as increased activity attracted even more official attention. Henri Lacoste, the former banker who had managed financial operations from Café Dia Rêve Perdu, recognized the situation's hopelessness earlier than most participants. In March 1928, he liquidated his assets and disappeared from Paris, leaving behind only a cryptic note suggesting that he had returned to legitimate banking in a location where artistic appreciation does not require pharmaceutical enhancement. Henri's departure triggered panic among other network operators who realized that someone with detailed knowledge of their financial arrangements was now beyond their control. Several other key figures attempted similar escapes, but most lacked Henri's financial sophistication and international connections. Their flight attempts only provided authorities with additional evidence of criminal activity, while leaving behind operations that quickly devolved into chaos. Without experienced management, the remaining cafes began operating with increasing desperation and decreasing concern for the safety of their customers. Drug quality became inconsistent as suppliers lost confidence in the network's ability to pay its debts. Violence erupted as different factions fought for control of the most profitable operations. Most dangerously, the systematic exploitation of wealthy young people became more aggressive and less subtle as operators tried to extract maximum value from relationships before the entire system collapsed. This final phase produced some of the network's most tragic casualties. Marie-Claire Dubois, Eliza's younger sister, had come to Paris seeking to help her sibling overcome what their family believed was artistic temperament rather than drug addiction. Marie-Claire possessed neither artistic talent nor significant wealth, but she was young, attractive, and desperate to save her sister. Network operators quickly identified her as someone who could be manipulated through emotional rather than financial incentives. Marie-Claire's exploitation followed a pattern that investigators would later discover had been used against dozens of other family members and friends of network participants. She was gradually drawn into cafe society through her legitimate concern for release, then convinced that understanding addiction required personal experience with drugs. Her initial resistance was overcome through carefully orchestrated peer pressure and emotional manipulation that presented drug use as evidence of love and loyalty to her sister. Within weeks, Marie-Claire had become addicted to heroin while believing she was conducting research that would help her save Elise. The two sisters spent their final months together in a shared delusion that their drug use was somehow therapeutic, each believing she was helping the other while both spiraled toward destruction. Their deaths, which occurred within days of each other in April 1928, epitomized the network's ability to corrupt even the most well-intentioned relationships. The Dubois deaths marked a turning point in public perception of the network. Previous casualties could be dismissed as the unfortunate consequences of adult choices, but Marie-Claire's story revealed how the system actively recruited and destroyed people whose only crime was loving someone already trapped within its operations. The systematic targeting of family members and friends transformed drug trafficking into something resembling a contagious disease that spread through social connections rather than simple criminal association. Detective Inspector Bertrand used the public outrage generated by cases like the Dubois sisters to justify increasingly aggressive investigative tactics. Simultaneous raids on 12 network-affiliated locations in May 1928 resulted in the arrest of over 60 people and the seizure of evidence that finally provided a complete picture of the organization's structure and operations. The evidence revealed that what had begun as informal drug dealing in bohemian cafes had evolved into a criminal enterprise with sophisticated operational procedures, financial management systems, and strategic planning capabilities. The network maintained detailed records of customer preferences, spending patterns, and psychological vulnerabilities that were used to maximize extraction of money from each target. Personnel files contained evaluations of employees based on their ability to manipulate specific types of victims, with bonuses paid for successfully recruiting wealthy or influential new customers. Most disturbing were the planning documents that revealed the network's intention to expand operations beyond Paris. Similar cafe-based operations were being established in London, New York, and Berlin, using lessons learned from the Parisian experiment to create more efficient and profitable criminal enterprises. The systematic exploitation of artistic culture was being packaged as a business model that could be replicated in any location with sufficient concentrations of wealthy young people seeking cultural authenticity. The international scope of the planned expansion elevated the investigation from local law enforcement matter to international security concern. Foreign governments that had initially pressured France to address the exploitation of their citizens now recognized that similar threats might emerge in their own territories. Diplomatic cooperation that had been limited to demands for action expanded to include intelligence sharing and coordinated law enforcement efforts. The network's collapse accelerated as participants realized that continued involvement meant not just criminal prosecution, but potential deportation and international scandal that would destroy their reputations permanently. Artists who had depended on drug-facilitated sales found themselves unable to maintain their lifestyles as customers disappeared, and legitimate galleries refused to associate with anyone connected to the scandal. The psychological impact was often more severe than the financial consequences. People who had structured their entire identities around membership in an exclusive artistic community discovered that this community had been deliberately created to exploit them. The relationships they had treasured as evidence of their sophisticated cultural understanding were revealed to have been calculated business arrangements designed to separate them from their money and independence. Jean-Baptiste Moreau, the war veteran whose initial encounter with heroin at Café de l'Amour had launched our exploration of this world, exemplified both the network's destructive power and the possibility of redemption that emerged from its collapse. Jean-Baptiste had been among the first people arrested in the May raids, but his cooperation with authorities earned him lenient treatment that allowed him to attempt recovery rather than face extended imprisonment. His testimony provided crucial insights into how the network had evolved from informal drug dealing to systematic criminal enterprise. Jean-Baptiste described the gradual transformation of café culture from genuine artistic community to predatory business operation, explaining how operators had learned to identify and exploit the specific vulnerabilities that made artists, writers, and wealthy young people susceptible to manipulation. Most importantly, Jean-Baptiste's recovery demonstrated that escape from the network was possible, though it required abandoning not just drugs, but the entire social and cultural identity that had become associated with artistic authenticity in 1920s Paris. His paintings created during recovery lacked the otherworldly intensity of his heroin-influenced work, but they possessed emotional honesty and technical competence that proved genuine artistic ability could exist independently of chemical enhancement. Jean-Baptiste's example inspired other network survivors to attempt their own recoveries, creating a small but significant community of people working to rebuild their lives after escaping the cafe-based criminal enterprise. Their efforts were supported by legitimate cultural institutions that recognized the need to provide alternatives to the toxic artistic culture that had made so many people vulnerable to exploitation. The recovery community's existence challenged one of the network's most insidious lies: the claim that drugs were necessary for authentic artistic expression. Artists who had created their best work while using heroin discovered that sobriety allowed them to develop their talents more consistently and sustainably, even if the results were less immediately spectacular than their drug-influenced pieces. However, the network's collapse also created genuine hardships for people who had become economically dependent on its operations. Artists whose work had been artificially supported by drug-related transactions found themselves unable to earn legitimate living through conventional gallery sales. The inflated prices that had seemed like evidence of success were revealed to have been unsustainable distortions that left participants unprepared for normal economic realities. Some former network participants never recovered from the financial and social devastation caused by the organization's collapse. Without the artificial support system that had maintained their lifestyles, they faced poverty, social isolation, and health problems that made rebuilding their lives extremely difficult. The network's destruction was necessary to prevent continued exploitation, but it also eliminated the only source of income and community that many people possessed. The human cost of both the network's operation and its collapse raised difficult questions about how society should address the complex relationships between artistic culture, mental health, economic vulnerability, and criminal exploitation. The cafe-based system had succeeded because it provided genuine benefits: social connection, cultural identity, and economic opportunity alongside its destructive elements. Simply eliminating the criminal aspects left many people without the support systems they needed to function in conventional society. These questions became more urgent as investigators discovered that network operations had extended far beyond drug trafficking and financial fraud. The systematic collection of information about wealthy families, government officials, and cultural institutions had created intelligence assets that could be used for blackmail, political manipulation, and industrial espionage. The network's collapse had prevented these capabilities from being fully developed, but their existence suggested that cafe-based criminal organizations could pose threats to national security as well as individual welfare. The investigation's revelations transformed how authorities throughout Europe approached the intersection of cultural activities and criminal behavior. Police departments established specialized units trained to recognize how legitimate artistic and intellectual communities could be infiltrated and exploited by criminal organizations. Educational institutions developed programs designed to help young people recognize and resist manipulation techniques that targeted their desires for cultural sophistication and social acceptance. Most significantly, the scandal forced a broader examination of how economic inequality and social displacement had created conditions that made large numbers of people vulnerable to exploitation. The network had succeeded not just because its operators were skillful manipulators, but because post-war society had failed to provide adequate support for people struggling with trauma, financial insecurity, and social alienation. The wealthy young people who had been targeted by network operators were not simply victims of criminal predation. They were casualties of a broader cultural crisis that had left an entire generation searching for meaning and identity in the aftermath of unprecedented social upheaval. The criminal network had provided artificial solutions to real problems, which explained both its initial appeal and the difficulty many people experienced in extracting themselves from its influence. Understanding this broader context was essential for preventing similar exploitation in the future. Simply prosecuting the criminals involved would not address the underlying conditions that had made their operations possible. Society needed to develop legitimate alternatives to the community, identity, and economic opportunity that criminal networks provided to their participants. The cafe network's legacy extended far beyond the specific people and institutions it had corrupted. Its operations had demonstrated how criminal organizations could exploit cultural prestige and social status to legitimize activities that would be immediately recognized as dangerous if presented in more obvious criminal contexts. This insight would prove valuable as authorities encountered similar schemes in other cities and cultural movements throughout the 20th century. The network had also revealed how international criminal organizations could use cultural exchange and artistic collaboration to facilitate activities that cross national borders and jurisdictional boundaries. The techniques developed by cafe operators for moving money, people, and contraband through legitimate cultural channels would be adopted by other criminal enterprises seeking to exploit globalized cultural and economic systems. Perhaps most importantly, the scandal had exposed the vulnerability of cultural institutions to criminal infiltration and the difficulty of distinguishing between legitimate artistic innovation and criminal manipulation when both operated within the same social and economic environments. This recognition would influence how cultural institutions, law enforcement agencies, and educational organizations approach the complex relationships between creativity, commerce, and crime throughout the modern era. As 1928 drew to a close, the immediate crisis created by the network's operations was largely resolved. The major operators had been arrested, prosecuted, or fled to other countries. The cafes that had served as operational centers had been closed or transformed into conventional establishments. The artificial art market that had sustained the entire enterprise had collapsed, forcing participants to seek legitimate alternatives or abandon their cultural aspirations entirely. But the deeper questions raised by the network's existence remained unanswered. How could society prevent the emergence of similar criminal enterprises while preserving the cultural dynamism and social freedom that made artistic innovation possible? How could legitimate institutions provide the community, identity, and economic opportunity that made criminal alternatives attractive to vulnerable individuals? And how could law enforcement agencies develop the expertise necessary to recognize and address sophisticated criminal operations that used cultural prestige rather than traditional violence or intimidation to control their victims and territories? These questions would continue to challenge policymakers, cultural leaders, and law enforcement professionals as they worked to understand and address the complex legacy of the heroin havens that had masqueraded as Parisian cafes during the 1920s. The network's collapse had ended one chapter in the history of organized crime and cultural exploitation, but it had also revealed patterns and vulnerabilities that would continue to influence how criminal organizations and legitimate institutions interacted throughout the remainder of the 20th century and beyond. The survivors of the network faced their own complex challenges as they attempted to rebuild their lives in the aftermath of an experience that had fundamentally altered their understanding of art, society, and human nature. Some would successfully create new identities and careers that incorporated lessons learned from their involvement in criminal activities. Others would struggle for decades with the psychological, financial, and social consequences of their participation in a system that had promised artistic authenticity while delivering systematic exploitation. Their stories would serve as warnings for future generations about the dangers of allowing criminal organizations to exploit cultural movements and artistic communities. But they would also demonstrate the resilience of human creativity and the possibility of redemption even after the most profound betrayal of trust and corruption of ideals. The network's tentacles had spread far beyond what even Detective Inspector Bertrand had initially comprehended. As winter descended upon Paris in late 1928, a new revelation emerged that would shake the foundations of European high society. The cafe operators hadn't simply been targeting random wealthy individuals. They had been systematically infiltrating the most powerful families across the continent through a web of connections that stretched from banking houses to royal courts. The discovery came through an unlikely source. A leather-bound journal discovered in the ruins of Café Morpheus after a suspicious fire had gutted the establishment in November. The journal, written in a coded script that took cryptographers 3 weeks to decipher, contained detailed profiles of over 200 individuals from Europe's most prominent families. Each entry included not just financial information, but intimate psychological assessments that revealed how cafe operators had studied their targets with scientific precision. Lady Catherine Pembroke's entry was typical of the journal's chilling thoroughness. The 22-year-old daughter of a British textile magnate had arrived in Paris in the spring of 1927, fleeing an arranged marriage to a man 3 decades her senior. The journal noted her profound need for paternal approval coupled with rebellious rejection of traditional authority figures, identifying this contradiction as the key to her eventual recruitment. Catherine's manipulation had been orchestrated over months through carefully planned encounters that appeared entirely coincidental. Her first contact with the network came through a charming Belgian count who struck up a conversation at a legitimate gallery opening, praising her sophisticated taste in avant-garde sculpture. The count, whose noble title was entirely fabricated, had been specifically chosen because his apparent aristocratic background would appeal to Catherine's class consciousness, while his continental mannerisms suggested the kind of sophisticated rebellion she craved. Their subsequent relationship followed a pattern that the journal revealed had been used successfully dozens of times. The Count introduced Catherine to increasingly exclusive cultural events, where drug use was gradually normalized through association with artistic sophistication. Her initial resistance was overcome not through direct pressure, but through carefully orchestrated social situations, where refusing to participate would have meant social isolation from the only community in Paris that seemed to understand her desire for authentic cultural experience. The journal's clinical documentation of Catherine's psychological manipulation read like a scientific paper on human vulnerability. Network operators had identified her specific insecurities about intellectual credibility, her desperate need for acceptance by people she perceived as culturally superior, and her underlying anger at family members who had tried to control her romantic choices. Each weakness had been systematically exploited through techniques that made Catherine feel she was making independent choices while actually following a script written by her manipulators. Catherine's financial exploitation had been equally methodical. The journal tracked her spending patterns, documenting how operators had gradually increased prices for both drugs and artwork as her addiction deepened. Initial purchases of 50 francs had escalated to transactions of several thousand francs as Catherine's tolerance increased and her judgment deteriorated. By the time of her arrest in the May raids, she had spent nearly her entire inheritance on purchases that investigation revealed were worthless outside the artificial market created by the criminal network. But Catherine's case was remarkable not for its exploitation techniques, which were repeated throughout the journal with mechanical consistency, but for what happened after her arrest. Unlike many network participants who collapsed psychologically when confronted with evidence of their manipulation, Catherine channeled her rage at being deceived into cooperation with authorities that proved devastatingly effective. Catherine possessed intimate knowledge of a network operations from the customer perspective, but she also had something equally valuable: detailed understanding of how the organization had infiltrated legitimate high society. Her social connections and aristocratic background had given her access to information that working-class addicts and struggling artists never possessed. She knew which embassy officials had been compromised, which banking executives had facilitated money laundering, and which cultural institutions had been corrupted by network influence. Her testimony revealed that the cafe-based operations were only the visible portion of a criminal enterprise that extended into the highest levels of European society. Network operators had used their control over addicted aristocrats and wealthy expatriates to gain access to information and influence that could be monetized far beyond simple drug trafficking. Blackmail schemes targeted government officials. Industrial espionage operations gathered intelligence for foreign competitors, and financial manipulation schemes moved money through international markets in ways that benefited criminal organizations throughout Europe. The scope of these secondary operations transformed the investigation from a local drug enforcement matter into an international security crisis. French authorities discovered that network operators had been selling information about military contracts, diplomatic negotiations, and industrial innovations to buyers whose identities remained hidden behind layers of intermediaries and coded communications. The cafe addicts had unknowingly served as intelligence assets whose social connections and family relationships provided access to secrets that could influence everything from stock prices to international treaties. Catherine's revelations about the network's intelligence operations led to one of the most shocking discoveries of the entire investigation. Prince Alessandro de Montecroce, heir to one of Italy's oldest noble families and a frequent visitor to Parisian cafe society, had been systematically feeding information about Italian military preparations to network operators, who were selling it to German intelligence services still operating despite the war's official conclusion. Alessandro's recruitment had followed the same pattern documented throughout the journal. Initial contact through seemingly accidental encounters, gradual introduction to drugs through cultural activities, and steady escalation of both addiction and financial exploitation. But Alessandro's political connections had made him valuable for purposes that extended far beyond the money he could provide through inflated art purchases. Network operators had encouraged Alessandro's drug dependency, specifically to compromise his judgment and loyalty to his own country. His addiction had made him desperate for continued access to heroin, while his social position provided access to military and diplomatic information that foreign intelligence services were willing to pay enormous sums to obtain. The cafe operators served as intermediaries in transactions that generated profits far exceeding anything possible through simple drug dealing. Alessandro's case revealed how the network had evolved from criminal enterprise to national security threat. The systematic targeting of individuals with access to sensitive information suggested coordination with foreign intelligence services that were using criminal organizations to gather intelligence while maintaining plausible deniability about their activities. The cafe operators weren't just drug dealers. They were assets in an international espionage network that used addiction and cultural manipulation to compromise the security of multiple European nations. The discovery of these intelligence operations triggered a diplomatic crisis that reverberated through European capitals. Governments that had initially viewed the Parisian cafe scandal as a local law enforcement matter suddenly recognized that their own national security had been compromised by criminal organizations operating under the cover of artistic culture. Intelligence agencies that had been focused on traditional military threats found themselves confronting a new form of espionage that exploited cultural exchange and social relationships rather than traditional diplomatic channels. The investigation's expansion into intelligence matters also revealed how the network's financial operations had been far more sophisticated than initially understood. Money generated through drug sales and art fraud had been invested in legitimate businesses that provided both cover for criminal activities and additional sources of revenue that could be used to expand operations. Network operators had purchased shares in shipping companies that transported their contraband, invested in banks that laundered their money, and acquired real estate that served as operational bases while generating rental income. Most disturbing was the discovery that network profits had been used to establish similar operations in other European cities. The Parisian cafe system was revealed to be a prototype for criminal organizations that were being replicated in London, Berlin, Vienna, and Rome. Each new operation had been refined based on lessons learned from the Paris experiment, making them more efficient at identifying targets, more sophisticated in their manipulation techniques, and more resistant to law enforcement detection. The international expansion of cafe-based criminal operations created enforcement challenges that existing law enforcement agencies were poorly equipped to address. Police departments that were organized to handle local crime found themselves confronting criminal networks that operated across national boundaries and used legitimate cultural institutions as cover for illegal activities. Traditional investigative techniques that relied on informants and surveillance were inadequate for addressing organizations that use psychological manipulation and social relationships rather than violence and intimidation to control their territories and victims. The complexity of these challenges was illustrated by the case of Dr. Hermann Weiss, a respected psychiatrist from Vienna who had been drawn into the network through his legitimate research into the therapeutic potential of various drugs. Weiss had initially visited Parisian cafes to observe how artists use substances to enhance creativity, hoping to develop treatments for patients suffering from depression and anxiety disorders that traditional medicine seemed unable to address effectively. Weiss's scientific training and medical credentials had made him an ideal target for network operators who recognized the value of having a legitimate medical professional associated with their activities. His presence in cafe society provided credibility that helped attract other potential customers, while his psychiatric expertise could be used to develop more effective manipulation techniques for targeting vulnerable individuals. The network had gradually compromised Weiss through techniques that exploited his genuine desire to help patients and advance medical knowledge. He was encouraged to experiment with increasingly powerful drugs, initially for research purposes, but eventually to satisfy his own growing addiction. His medical practice in Vienna became a source of pharmaceutical supplies that were diverted to network operations, while his patient relationships provided access to wealthy individuals who could be targeted for recruitment. Weiss's involvement illustrated how the network had learned to exploit professional ethics and altruistic motivations as effectively as personal vulnerabilities and financial greed. His belief that he was conducting important medical research had been manipulated to make him complicit in criminal activities that contradicted everything he claimed to believe about helping people and advancing human knowledge. The psychological manipulation had been so sophisticated that Weiss continued to believe he was serving legitimate medical purposes even after his arrest and confrontation with evidence of his role in systematic criminal exploitation. The Weiss case also revealed how the network had been developing techniques for large-scale psychological manipulation that could be applied to populations rather than just individuals. His psychiatric expertise had been used to create recruitment protocols that could identify vulnerable people through observable behavioral patterns, manipulation scripts that could be used by relatively untrained operatives to achieve consistent results, and control mechanisms that could maintain loyalty and compliance even when participants began to recognize the criminal nature of their activities. These population-level manipulation techniques represented an evolution in criminal methodology that law enforcement agencies were completely unprepared to address. Traditional crime fighting focused on punishing individual criminals after they had committed specific illegal acts. But the network had developed capabilities for systematically creating criminals by manipulating people into committing acts they wouldn't normally consider while believing they were pursuing legitimate goals. The implications extended far beyond law enforcement into fundamental questions about free will, moral responsibility, and social control. If criminal organizations could use psychological manipulation to make ordinary people complicit in activities they would normally reject, how could society distinguish between victims and perpetrators. How could legal systems designed to punish individual choices address crimes that resulted from systematic manipulation of human psychology? These philosophical questions became practically urgent as the investigation revealed the extent to which network operations had relied on unwitting collaboration by people who believed they were engaged in legitimate activities. Gallery owners who had facilitated money laundering thought they were simply selling art to enthusiastic collectors. Bank officials who had processed suspicious transactions believed they were serving valued customers with eccentric financial habits. Even some police officials who had ignored network activities had been convinced they were protecting artistic freedom rather than enabling criminal enterprises. The scale of unwitting collaboration suggested that the network's success had depended not just on criminal skill, but on exploiting the trust and good intentions that made civilized society possible. By disguising criminal activities as cultural and artistic pursuits, network operators had been able to recruit accomplices from among the most respected and of society. The revelation well-intentioned members that their trust had been systematically exploited created a crisis of confidence that extended far beyond the immediate participants in network activities. This crisis was exemplified by the case of Father Michel Dubois, a Catholic priest whose genuine desire to help troubled young people had been exploited to provide network operators with access to vulnerable individuals from respectable families. Father Dubois had established a program that offered counseling and support to young people struggling with what he understood to be spiritual and emotional difficulties resulting from the war's psychological trauma. Network operators had identified Father Dubois' program as an ideal source of potential recruits who possessed both emotional vulnerability and family resources that could be exploited. They had gradually infiltrated his counseling sessions through individuals who posed as reformed addicts seeking spiritual guidance, while actually gathering intelligence about other participants who might be suitable targets for recruitment. The manipulation of Father Dubois had been particularly sophisticated because it exploited his religious convictions rather than challenging them. Network operatives had convinced him that helping troubled young people required understanding their struggles through direct experience, gradually leading him to believe that limited experimentation with drugs was necessary for effective ministry to addicted individuals. Father Dubois' involvement had provided network operators with both legitimacy and access that would have been impossible to obtain through purely criminal means. His endorsement of certain individuals as spiritually reformed had convinced families to trust people who were actually network operatives. His religious authority had been used to present drug experimentation as spiritual exploration rather than criminal activity. Most tragically, his genuine care for troubled young people had been weaponized to facilitate their exploitation by criminal organizations that viewed them as nothing more than sources of revenue. The revelation of Father Dubois' manipulation created a scandal within the Catholic Church that reverberated throughout France's religious communities. If respected clergy could be deceived into facilitating criminal exploitation of vulnerable individuals, how could any institution trust its ability to distinguish between legitimate social service and criminal manipulation? The case forced religious organizations throughout Europe to examine their own vulnerability to infiltration by criminal enterprises that might exploit their altruistic missions for illegal purposes. The broader implications of systematic manipulation became even more troubling as investigators discovered evidence that network operators had been documenting their techniques for potential sale to other criminal organizations or foreign intelligence services. Detailed manuals found in raided locations contained step-by-step instructions for identifying vulnerable targets, techniques for psychological manipulation that could be applied in various cultural contexts, and organizational structures that could be adapted to different legal and social environments. These manuals represented a form of criminal intellectual property that could be used to replicate network operations in any location with suitable populations of wealthy, psychologically vulnerable individuals. The techniques that had been developed through years of experimentation in Parisian cafes could be applied to exploit similar populations in other cities, creating a potential epidemic of criminal organizations that used cultural manipulation rather than traditional violence to achieve their goals. The existence of these instructional materials also suggested that network operators had been planning expansion on a scale that would have transformed them from regional criminal enterprise to international threat, capable of influencing political and economic systems throughout Europe. The cafe operations had been intended as proof of concept experiments that would demonstrate the viability of psychological manipulation as a criminal methodology that could be scaled up and applied to increasingly ambitious targets. Investigation of the network's expansion plans revealed connections to political movements and revolutionary organizations that had been seeking techniques for mass psychological manipulation that could be used to destabilize existing governments and social systems. The cafe operators had been in communication with radical political groups that were interested in applying criminal manipulation techniques to political organizing, creating possibilities for criminal political alliances that could threaten the stability of democratic institutions. These connections between criminal manipulation and political radicalism created new categories of security threats that existing institutions were poorly equipped to address. Law enforcement agencies trained to handle traditional crime lacked expertise in political intelligence, while intelligence services focused on foreign threats had limited understanding of domestic criminal organizations. The intersection of crime and politics created jurisdictional ambiguities that criminal organizations could exploit to avoid effective law enforcement response. The complexity of these intersections was illustrated by the case of Dmitry Vulov, a Russian immigrant who had fled the Bolshevik Revolution and arrived in Paris with minimal resources but extensive connections to other displaced aristocrats and political refugees. Vulov had been recruited by network operators not for his personal wealth, which was limited, but for his access to a community of politically displaced individuals who possessed both valuable intelligence and desperate need for the kind of community and purpose that criminal organizations could provide. Vulov's recruitment had followed techniques documented in the network's instructional materials, but adapted to exploit political rather than purely personal vulnerabilities. His anger at the communist revolution that had destroyed his family's position was channeled into activities that he believed were contributing to counter-revolutionary efforts. While his addiction to drugs, provided through network connections, ensured his continued compliance with increasingly compromising demands through Vulov network operators, had gained access to information about immigrant political activities, foreign intelligence operations targeting Soviet interests and financial networks that supported anti-communist organizations throughout Europe. This intelligence was valuable to multiple buyers, including Soviet agents who were willing to pay substantial sums for information about immigrant activities and Western intelligence services that wanted to monitor both Soviet operations and immigrant organizations that might be infiltrated by communist agents. Volkov's case demonstrated how network operators had learned to exploit political conflicts and international tensions to generate revenue streams that extended far beyond simple drug trafficking. By positioning themselves as intermediaries between competing intelligence services and political organizations, they had created business opportunities that could generate enormous profits while providing cover for their criminal activities through association with seemingly legitimate political causes. The intersection of criminal manipulation and political intelligence also created opportunities for foreign governments to influence domestic affairs in other countries through support for criminal organizations that could destabilize social institutions and corrupt cultural movements. The Cafe Network's operations had demonstrated that criminal organizations could effectively undermine social trust and institutional authority while generating profits and intelligence that could be valuable to foreign powers seeking to weaken their rivals. These possibilities for criminal political collaboration represented a new form of asymmetric warfare that could be conducted without traditional military means, while achieving strategic objectives that would be difficult to accomplish through conventional diplomacy or military action. By supporting criminal organizations that specialized in psychological manipulation and social corruption, foreign governments could potentially destabilize rival nations from within, while maintaining plausible deniability about their involvement in hostile activities. The recognition of these possibilities transformed the Cafe Network investigation from criminal law enforcement matter to national security priority that required coordination between multiple government agencies and international partners. The techniques that had been developed for exploiting individual vulnerabilities were recognized as potentially applicable to societal vulnerabilities that could threaten the stability of democratic institutions and social systems. As 1929 began, the investigation had evolved far beyond its original focus on drug trafficking and art fraud to encompass questions about psychological warfare, political subversion, and the vulnerability of open societies to systematic manipulation by hostile actors. The heroin havens that had masqueraded as bohemian cafes had revealed weaknesses in modern civilization that would continue to challenge policymakers and security professionals throughout the 20th century and beyond. The network's participants found themselves caught in the middle of conflicts they had never understood. Their personal struggles with addiction and exploitation transformed into elements of larger political and security battles that would determine the future of European civilization. Their stories of manipulation and betrayal had become cautionary tales about the vulnerability of individual freedom in an age when psychological manipulation had become a weapon that could be wielded by criminal organizations and hostile governments with equal effectiveness. The cafe culture that had once promised artistic authenticity and cultural sophistication had been revealed as a sophisticated trap designed to exploit the very human desires for meaning, community, and creative expression that made civilization worth preserving. Understanding how these desires had been weaponized would be essential for protecting future generations from similar exploitation, while preserving the cultural freedom and social openness that criminal organizations had learned to exploit so effectively. The investigation continued to reveal new layers of complexity and international connection that suggested the full scope of the network's operations might never be completely understood. But the evidence already gathered had provided insights into human vulnerability and criminal methodology that would influence law enforcement, intelligence operations, and social policy for decades to come. The heroin havens of 1920s Paris had become a laboratory for techniques of social manipulation that would echo through history long after the last cafe had been closed, and the final participant had faced justice for their role in one of the most sophisticated criminal conspiracies of the modern era. The investigation's tentacles reached into the most unexpected corners of European society, revealing how the network had systematically targeted not just individuals, but entire institutions that formed the backbone of civilized order. As spring arrived in Paris in 1929, Detective Inspector Bertrand discovered that the corruption extended into realms that shocked even his cynical sensibilities. The breakthrough came through Countess Isabella von Habsburg, a legitimate Austrian aristocrat whose addiction had made her a willing accomplice in schemes that threatened the very foundations of European banking. Isabella's story began in the autumn of 1926, when she arrived in Paris, fleeing a marriage scandal that had destroyed her reputation in Vienna's conservative social circles. At 35, she possessed both the sophistication to navigate high society and the desperation that made her vulnerable to exploitation. Isabella's recruitment had been orchestrated by someone calling himself Baron Friedrich von Zeckendorf, whose noble credentials were as fabricated as his charm was genuine. The Baron understood that Isabella's disgrace in Austrian society had created a hunger for acceptance that could be satisfied through association with Paris's avant-garde cultural movements. He introduced her to café society as a refuge, where her past scandals would be viewed as evidence of sophisticated rebellion rather than moral failure. The Baron's manipulation of Isabella was masterful in its subtlety. He never directly encouraged her drug use, but created social situations where abstinence would have meant isolation from the only community in Paris that seemed to understand her situation. Isabella's first injection occurred during what she believed was an intimate artistic salon, where drug use was presented as necessary for appreciating experimental poetry that challenged conventional literary boundaries. Within months, Isabella's addiction had progressed to the point where maintaining her habit required increasingly desperate financial measures. Her family's Austrian properties provided collateral for loans that were channeled through network-controlled banks, creating paper trails that disguised drug transactions as legitimate business investments. But Isabella's value to the network extended far beyond her personal wealth. Through her Habsburg connections, Isabella possessed access to information about European royal families, diplomatic negotiations, and financial arrangements that could influence everything from currency values to territorial disputes. Network operators encouraged her to maintain correspondence with relatives and family friends throughout the Austrian Empire, using her letters to gather intelligence that was then sold to buyers whose identities remained hidden behind layers of intermediaries. Isabella's case revealed how the network had learned to exploit aristocratic social networks that had been weakened by the war, but still maintained enough influence to affect political and economic decisions. Noble families that had lost political power still possessed social connections and insider knowledge that could be valuable to criminal organizations seeking to manipulate markets or influence government policies. The systematic exploitation of aristocratic networks was coordinated by someone the investigation never fully identified, known only as the architect. This individual possessed intimate knowledge of European noble genealogies, diplomatic protocols, and financial systems that suggested either aristocratic background or professional training in intelligence operations. The architect never appeared in person at cafe gatherings, but their influence was evident in the sophisticated strategies used to target and exploit specific noble families. Under the architect's guidance, network operators had created detailed maps of European aristocratic relationships, identifying which families possessed access to valuable information and which individuals within those families might be vulnerable to recruitment. The targeting was so precise that investigators suspected the involvement of intelligence professionals who understood how to exploit social and political networks for strategic advantage. The discovery of aristocratic targeting protocols transformed the investigation into a matter of international security that required cooperation between intelligence services throughout Europe. Governments that had initially viewed the cafe network as a criminal law enforcement issue suddenly recognized that their own diplomatic and financial systems had been compromised by organizations that possessed detailed intelligence about their most sensitive operations. The scope of intelligence compromise became apparent through the case of Lord Reginald Ashworth, a British diplomat whose addiction to opium had been carefully cultivated to provide network operators with advanced knowledge of diplomatic negotiations that could affect commodity prices and currency values. Ashworth's recruitment had begun during legitimate cultural exchanges between British and French artistic institutions, making his compromise virtually undetectable to security services that focused on traditional espionage threats. Ashworth's diplomatic position had provided access to information about trade agreements, military treaties, and colonial policies that network operators sold to buyers who used the intelligence to manipulate financial markets. The profits generated through this insider trading were far greater than anything possible through simple drug trafficking, demonstrating how criminal organizations could leverage cultural infiltration to access economic opportunities that traditional criminals could never exploit. The financial manipulation schemes revealed through Ashworth's case were so sophisticated that they required cooperation between criminal organizations and legitimate financial institutions throughout Europe. Banks that processed suspicious transactions had been convinced they were facilitating legitimate business activities by clients whose aristocratic credentials and cultural interests disguise the criminal nature of their operations. Investigation of these financial networks revealed that network operators had been systematically infiltrating legitimate banking institutions through employees who were gradually compromised through drug addiction and social pressure. Bank clear clerks who frequented cafe society found themselves processing transactions that they were told involved art sales or cultural exchanges, while actually facilitating money laundering operations that moved criminal profits through international financial systems. The banking infiltration was coordinated by Henri Lacoste's successor, a mysterious figure known as the Treasurer, who possessed expertise in international finance that allowed the network to exploit regulatory gaps between different national banking systems. The Treasurer had established a web of shell companies and offshore accounts that made tracking criminal profits virtually impossible, while creating legitimate-appearing paper trails that satisfied banking compliance requirements. The sophistication of these financial operations suggested involvement by professionals with extensive experience in international banking and investment management. The network had recruited individuals from legitimate financial institutions who possessed both technical expertise and access to systems that could be exploited for criminal purposes. Their involvement had transformed simple drug trafficking into a complex financial conspiracy that threatened the integrity of European banking systems. The investigation of banking infiltration led to one of the most shocking discoveries of the entire case. Evidence that network operators had been planning to use their financial capabilities to manipulate currency markets during periods of political instability. Documents found in raided locations contained detailed analyses of how drug profits could be leveraged to influence exchange rates during diplomatic crisis, potentially affecting the outcomes of international negotiations. These currency manipulation schemes would have required coordination with hostile foreign governments that possess the resources and motivation to destabilize European financial systems. The network's operations had evolved from criminal enterprise to potential weapon of economic warfare that could be used to undermine the stability of democratic nations through manipulation of their financial systems. The recognition of these possibilities elevated the investigation to the highest levels of government throughout Europe. Intelligence services that had been focused on traditional military threats found themselves confronting a new form of asymmetric warfare that used criminal organizations and cultural infiltration rather than conventional military means to achieve strategic objectives. The complexity of these threats was illustrated by the case of Professor Ludwig Zimmermann, a respected economist from the University of Berlin, whose addiction to cocaine had been exploited to provide network operators with detailed analyses of European financial systems and their vulnerabilities to manipulation. Zimmermann's academic credentials had given him access to confidential government economic data that network operators use to develop strategies for currency speculation and market manipulation. Zimmermann's recruitment had followed the familiar pattern of gradual compromise through cultural activities. But his case revealed how network operators had learned to exploit intellectual curiosity and academic ambition as effectively as personal trauma or financial desperation. His belief that he was contributing to important economic research had been manipulated to make him complicit in activities that contradicted everything he claimed to believe about honest scholarship and public service. The exploitation of academic institutions represented another dimension of the network's evolution, from criminal enterprise to systematic threat against the foundations of civilized society. Universities and research institutions that should have served as sources of objective knowledge and critical thinking had been infiltrated by criminal organizations that used academic credibility to legitimize their activities while gathering intelligence that could be used for illegal purposes. The academic infiltration was particularly dangerous because it threatened the integrity of knowledge systems that democratic societies depended upon for informed decision-making. If criminal organizations could manipulate academic research and expert analysis, they could potentially influence public policy and social attitudes in ways that serve their criminal objectives while appearing to be based on legitimate scholarly authority. Investigation of academic compromise revealed that network operators had been systematically targeting universities and research institutions throughout Europe, identifying scholars whose work could be useful for criminal purposes and developing strategies for recruitment that exploited academic culture and professional incentives. The targeting was so systematic that investigators suspected coordination by intelligence professionals who understood how to exploit academic institutions for strategic advantage. The academic infiltration schemes were coordinated by an individual known as the scholar, whose identity remained hidden, but whose influence was evident in the sophisticated techniques used to compromise researchers and manipulate academic institutions. The scholar possessed intimate knowledge of academic culture and scholarly communication networks that suggested either extensive university experience or professional training in intelligence operations, targeting academic institutions. Under the scholar's guidance, network operators had developed techniques for influencing academic research that could shape public understanding of issues relevant to their criminal operations. Scholars who had been compromised through drug addiction or financial pressure found themselves producing research that supported policy positions favorable to criminal organizations while believing they were engaged in objective academic inquiry. The manipulation of academic research was particularly insidious because it exploited the trust that democratic societies placed in scholarly expertise and scientific methodology. Citizens who relied on academic authority to inform their political and social decisions were unknowingly influenced by research that had been corrupted by criminal organizations seeking to advance their illegal objectives. The discovery of academic manipulation created a crisis of confidence in intellectual institutions that extended far beyond the immediate participants in network activities. If respected scholars could be manipulated into producing corrupted research, how could society distinguish between legitimate knowledge and criminal propaganda disguised as academic authority? These questions became practically urgent as the investigation revealed that network-influenced research had been used to support policy positions that would have benefited criminal organizations while appearing to be based on objective scholarly analysis. Academic papers that advocated for reduced law enforcement funding, liberalized drug policies, and weakened financial regulations had been produced by scholars who were unknowingly serving criminal interests while believing they were advancing legitimate intellectual and policy goals. The extent of academic compromise was illustrated by the case of Dr. Margaret Thornfield, a respected criminologist from Cambridge University, whose research on drug policy had been systematically influenced by network operators who provided her with funding, research subjects, and data that supported conclusions favorable to their criminal objectives. Dr. Thornfield's academic reputation had given her research credibility that influenced policy discussions throughout Europe. While her compromised methodology had produced conclusions that served criminal rather than public interests, Dr. Thornfield's case revealed how network operators had learned to exploit academic funding systems and research methodologies to influence scholarly conclusions while maintaining the appearance of objective inquiry. Her addiction to heroin, which had developed through her research into drug use patterns, had made her dependent on network cooperation for continued access to research subjects and data sources that were essential for her academic career. The manipulation of Dr. Thornfield's research had been so sophisticated that she never recognized how her scholarly objectivity had been compromised by her personal addiction and professional dependence on criminal organizations. Her belief that she was conducting important research that would inform humane drug policies had been manipulated to produce academic authority for positions that actually served criminal interests rather than public welfare. The revelation that respected academic research had been corrupted by criminal manipulation created a scandal that reverberated throughout European intellectual communities. Universities that had prided themselves on scholarly independence found themselves questioning whether their research had been compromised by criminal organizations that understood how to exploit academic culture and professional incentives. The academic scandal also revealed how network operators had been planning to use corrupted research to influence public policy discussions that could affect law enforcement capabilities and regulatory frameworks. Academic papers that advocated for policies favorable to criminal organizations had been strategically published and promoted to influence political debates about crime, drugs, and financial regulation. These influence operations represented a form of intellectual warfare that could potentially undermine democratic decision-making by corrupting the knowledge systems that informed public policy. If criminal organizations could manipulate academic research and expert analysis, they could potentially influence political outcomes in ways that serve their illegal objectives while appearing to be based on legitimate scholarly authority. The recognition of these possibilities transformed the Café Network investigation into a comprehensive examination of how criminal organizations could exploit the openness and trust that made democratic societies function effectively. The techniques that had been developed for manipulating individuals had been scaled up to target institutions and knowledge systems that were essential for civilized governance. As the investigation expanded to examine academic and institutional compromise, it became clear that the network's operations had been far more ambitious than simple criminal enterprise. The systematic targeting of cultural institutions, financial systems, political networks, and academic research suggested coordination by organizations that possess strategic objectives extending far beyond criminal profit. The possibility that the Café network had been serving foreign intelligence interests or political movements seeking to destabilize democratic societies created new urgency for investigation efforts that had already revealed more complexity than law enforcement agencies were equipped to handle. The heroin havens of Parisian cafes had been revealed as components of a sophisticated assault on the foundations of European civilization that would require unprecedented cooperation between law enforcement, intelligence services, and democratic institutions to address effectively. The network's participants found themselves caught in conflicts they had never understood. Their personal struggles with addiction and cultural alienation transformed into elements of larger battles over the future of democratic society. Their stories had become cautionary tales about the vulnerability of human freedom in an age when psychological manipulation and institutional corruption had become weapons that could be wielded by hostile forces seeking to undermine the foundations of civilized order. The investigation continued to reveal new dimensions of the conspiracy that suggested the full scope of the network's operations might never be completely understood. But the evidence already gathered had provided insights into the vulnerability of democratic institutions and open societies that would influence security policy and law enforcement practices for generations to come. The Bohemian cafes, where artists had sought inspiration through chemical enhancement, had been revealed as laboratories for techniques of social manipulation and institutional corruption that would echo through history long after the last participant had faced justice for their role in one of the most sophisticated threats to democratic civilization in the modern era. The spring of 1929 brought revelations that would forever change how European societies understood the relationship between cultural freedom and national security. The Café network had demonstrated that the very openness and tolerance that made democratic civilization worth preserving could be systematically exploited by hostile forces seeking to destroy the foundations of free society from within. Understanding and addressing these vulnerabilities would become one of the defining challenges of the 20th century as democratic nations struggled to preserve their values while defending against enemies who had learned to weaponize the trust and freedom that made those values possible. The investigation had reached a critical juncture when Detective Inspector Bertrand received an encrypted telegram from London that would transform everything he thought he understood about the Café network's true purpose. The message sent through diplomatic channels by British intelligence contained a single devastating revelation. The network's operations were being replicated simultaneously in 12 major European cities, suggesting coordination by an organization far more sophisticated than anyone had imagined. The telegram's contents were based on intelligence gathered by Agent Sarah Whitmore, a British operative who had been conducting parallel investigations in London's Bloomsbury district. Whitmore had discovered that wealthy British expatriates were returning from Paris with more than just artistic inspiration and narcotic dependencies. They were carrying detailed instructions for establishing similar operations that could target Britain's aristocratic and intellectual elite through the same cultural manipulation techniques that had proven so effective in French café society. Agent Whitmore's investigation had begun when Lord Peaton's youngest son, Charles, had died of a heroin overdose in his Mayfair apartment surrounded by paintings that subsequent analysis revealed were worthless forgeries purchased for astronomical sums. Charles's death had initially been dismissed as another tragic example of aristocratic excess, But Whitmore's examination of his financial records revealed transaction patterns that mirrored those discovered in the Parisian investigation. Charles had spent the previous 18 months traveling between Paris and London, ostensibly pursuing his interests in avant-garde literature and experimental theatre. But his actual activities, reconstructed through painstaking investigation of his correspondence and financial dealings, revealed systematic recruitment of vulnerable individuals from Britain's most prominent families. His social connections had provided access to people whose psychological profiles matched those documented in the network's targeting protocols. The British operation had been established in a series of private clubs and artistic salons that appeared to serve legitimate cultural purposes while actually functioning as recruitment centres for criminal activities. The Annium Society, housed in a Georgian mansion near Russell Square, had attracted young intellectuals and artists through lectures on contemporary European culture and exhibitions of work by promising continental artists. But the Society's real purpose was identifying and cultivating individuals who might be suitable for more intensive manipulation. The Society's operations were managed by someone calling herself Lady Vivian Ashcraftoft, whose aristocratic credentials were as fabricated as her interest in artistic patronage. Lady Ashcraftoft possessed intimate knowledge of British social hierarchies and cultural movements that allowed her to present herself as a sophisticated cultural authority, while actually serving as a recruitment specialist for criminal organisations seeking to exploit British wealth and influence. Lady Ashcroft's manipulation techniques had been refined through experience with dozens of targets, each providing lessons that improved her ability to identify vulnerabilities and exploit them systematically. Her approach varied, depending on the specific psychological profile of each target, but always involved gradual introduction to increasingly exclusive cultural activities where drug use was normalized through association with intellectual sophistication and artistic authenticity. The British operation's most significant success had been the recruitment of Sir Reginald Blackwood, a prominent banker whose position at the Bank of England had provided access to information about monetary policy and international financial agreements. Blackwood's addiction to cocaine had been carefully cultivated through his involvement in society activities, while his belief that he was supporting important cultural initiatives had been manipulated to secure his cooperation with increasingly compromising requests for confidential information. Through Blackwood, the network had gained advanced knowledge of British currency policies and international trade agreements that allowed coordinated speculation in financial markets throughout Europe. The profits generated through this insider trading had been used to fund expansion of network operations while providing resources for more ambitious manipulation schemes targeting government officials and military personnel. The British operations' financial sophistication had exceeded even the Parisian network's capabilities, demonstrating how criminal organizations could adapt their techniques to exploit the specific characteristics of different national financial systems. The coordination required for simultaneous market manipulation across multiple countries suggested involvement by organizations that possess both criminal expertise and strategic intelligence capabilities that extended far beyond simple profit motives. Agent Whitmore's investigation had also revealed connections between the British operation and political movements that were seeking to undermine public confidence in democratic institutions through systematic corruption of cultural and intellectual leadership. The network's targeting of university professors, literary critics, and political commentators had been designed to influence public opinion on issues ranging from drug policy to international relations. The political dimensions of the British operation had been coordinated by an individual known as the ideologist, whose identity remained hidden, but whose influence was evident in the sophisticated propaganda techniques used to manipulate public discourse. The ideologist possessed extensive knowledge of British political culture and media systems that suggested either insider political experience or professional training in psychological warfare operations. Under the ideologist's guidance, network operators had developed techniques for influencing political debates through manipulation of intellectual authorities and cultural leaders who shaped public opinion. Professors who had been compromised through drug addiction found themselves producing research that supported political positions favorable to criminal organizations while believing they were engaged in objective scholarly inquiry. The manipulation of British political discourse had been particularly focused on issues related to law enforcement capabilities and international cooperation in addressing transnational crime. Academic papers and newspaper articles that advocated for reduced police powers and weakened international intelligence sharing had been produced by scholars and journalists who were unknowingly serving criminal interests while believing they were advancing legitimate political and policy goals. The discovery of systematic political manipulation created a crisis within British intelligence services that had been focused on traditional foreign threats, while failing to recognize how domestic cultural institutions could be exploited by hostile organizations. The network's operations had demonstrated that open societies were vulnerable to forms of attack that used democratic freedoms and cultural tolerance as weapons against the systems they were designed to protect. The British intelligence revelations coincided with similar discoveries in other European capitals, where parallel investigations were uncovering evidence of coordinated criminal operations that shared techniques, funding sources, and strategic objectives. The Café network had been revealed as one component of a continental conspiracy that threatened the stability of democratic civilization throughout Europe. In Berlin, German authorities had discovered that several prominent cabarets and artistic venues were serving functions identical to those performed by Parisian cafés. The German operations had been adapted to exploit the specific cultural and political conditions created by the war's aftermath, targeting individuals whose psychological wounds and financial desperation made them vulnerable to manipulation by organizations that promised community and purpose. The Berlin network had been particularly successful at recruiting former military officers whose post-war struggles with unemployment and social displacement had made them susceptible to involvement in activities that provided both income and a sense of continued service to causes larger than themselves. These veterans possessed knowledge of military systems and government operations that was valuable to criminal organizations seeking to influence political developments or gather intelligence for foreign buyers. Colonel Ernst Müller exemplified the tragic exploitation of military veterans by criminal organizations that understood how to weaponize their service orientation and leadership capabilities. Müller had commanded a regiment during the war's final campaigns, earning decorations for courage under fire and developing deep loyalty to subordinates who had served under impossible conditions. His post-war transition to civilian life had been catastrophic, as the skills that made him an effective military leader proved useless in a peacetime economy that had little use for former officers. Müller's recruitment by the Berlin network had exploited his desperate need for purpose and his loyalty to former comrades who were struggling with similar post-war adjustment difficulties. Network operators had convinced him that his involvement in their activities was serving the interests of veterans who needed financial support and meaningful work opportunities. His belief that he was helping fellow soldiers had been manipulated to secure his cooperation with increasingly criminal activities. Through Müller's military connections, the network had gained access to weapons, transportation capabilities, and operational expertise that transformed their criminal activities into something resembling paramilitary operations. The systematic targeting of government officials and business leaders had been conducted with military precision that made traditional law enforcement responses inadequate for addressing the scope and sophistication of the threat. The militarization of criminal operations represented a new form of threat that existing law enforcement agencies were poorly equipped to address. Police departments that were organized to handle civilian crime found themselves confronting organizations that possessed military training and equipment while operating under the cover of cultural and artistic activities that made aggressive enforcement responses politically difficult. The complexity of these military criminal connections was illustrated by the case of Captain Hans Weber, a former intelligence officer whose post-war involvement in network operations had been motivated by his belief that he was serving German national interests through intelligence gathering and political influence operations. Weber's military training had made him valuable for planning and executing sophisticated criminal schemes, while his intelligence background had provided techniques for maintaining operational security and avoiding law enforcement detection. Weber's case revealed how network operators had learned to exploit patriotic motivations and national loyalties to recruit individuals whose skills and connections could advance criminal objectives while appearing to serve legitimate political purposes. His involvement in activities that he believed were advancing German interests had actually served the purposes of international criminal organizations that had no loyalty to any particular nation or political system. The exploitation of patriotic motivations represented another dimension of the network's psychological manipulation capabilities, demonstrating how criminal organizations could weaponize the highest human ideals to achieve the lowest criminal purposes. Veterans who had sacrificed everything for their countries found themselves betraying those same countries while believing they were continuing their service to causes they held sacred. The pattern of veteran exploitation was repeated throughout Europe, where similar criminal networks had identified former military personnel as ideal targets for recruitment due to their combination of operational capabilities, psychological vulnerabilities, and social displacement. The systematic targeting of veterans represented a form of warfare against the military institutions that democratic societies depended upon for their defense. In Vienna, Austrian authorities had discovered that network operations had been specifically designed to exploit the collapse of the Habsburg Empire and the social chaos that had followed the dissolution of traditional political and cultural institutions. The targeting of displaced aristocrats and former government officials had been coordinated with broader strategies for destabilizing the new Austrian Republic through corruption of its emerging democratic institutions. The Vienna network had been established by Count Anton von Seckendorf, whose legitimate aristocratic credentials had provided access to displaced noble families, whose financial desperation and social displacement made them vulnerable to recruitment by organizations that promised restoration of their former status and influence. The Count's manipulation of aristocratic nostalgia and resentment had been used to create a criminal organization that combined traditional criminal activities with political subversion aimed at undermining democratic governance. Count von Seckendorf's operations had been particularly focused on corrupting the new Austrian banking system through recruitment of former imperial bureaucrats who possessed knowledge of financial systems and regulatory procedures that could be exploited for criminal purposes. The systematic infiltration of legitimate financial institutions had created opportunities for massive fraud and money laundering that generated resources for more ambitious political manipulation schemes. The Austrian network's political dimensions had been coordinated with similar operations in Hungary and Czechoslovakia, where parallel criminal organizations were working to destabilize the new democratic governments that had emerged from the Habsburg Empire's dissolution. The coordination between these operations suggested strategic planning by organizations that possessed both criminal expertise and political objectives that extended far beyond simple profit maximization. The revelation of coordinated political subversion throughout Central Europe created alarm within the new democratic governments that had struggled to establish legitimacy and stability in the aftermath of imperial collapse. The network's operations had exploited the very political transitions that were supposed to create more democratic and responsive governance, using the chaos of political change to establish criminal influence over emerging institutions. The scope of political manipulation was illustrated by the case of Dr. Franz Moravich, a respected economist who had been recruited to serve in the new Czechoslovak government's finance ministry, while secretly providing information to network operators who used his insider knowledge to manipulate currency markets and government bond prices. Moravich's belief that his involvement in network activities was serving Czech national interests had been systematically exploited to secure his cooperation with schemes that actually weakened the new nation's financial stability. Moravich's case revealed how network operators had learned to exploit nationalist sentiments and political idealism to recruit individuals whose positions in government provided access to information and influence that could be used for criminal purposes. His involvement in activities that he believed were advancing Czech independence had actually served the interests of international criminal organizations that profited from political instability and institutional corruption. The exploitation of political idealism represented perhaps the most insidious aspect of the network's manipulation techniques, demonstrating how criminal organizations could corrupt the democratic processes that were essential for legitimate governance. Officials who had dedicated their lives to public service found themselves betraying the public trust while believing they were serving higher purposes that justified their involvement in increasingly compromising activities. The pattern of government infiltration was repeated throughout Europe, where network operators had systematically targeted the emerging democratic institutions that were replacing the imperial and monarchical systems destroyed by the war. The timing of these recruitment efforts suggested coordination by organizations that understood how to exploit the vulnerabilities created by political transition and institutional instability. By the summer of 1929, the investigation had revealed a conspiracy of such scope and sophistication that it challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of crime and the capabilities of criminal organizations. The Café network had been revealed as one component of a continental criminal enterprise that combined traditional illegal activities with systematic attacks on the cultural, financial, political, and military institutions that supported democratic civilization. The network's participants had become unwitting soldiers in a war against the foundations of free society. Their personal struggles with addiction and alienation transformed into weapons that could be used to undermine the very systems that should have provided them with security and opportunity. Their stories had become cautionary tales about the vulnerability of human nature and democratic institutions to systematic manipulation by organizations that possessed both criminal ruthlessness and strategic intelligence capabilities. The investigation's revelations had created unprecedented challenges for law enforcement and intelligence agencies that were organized to address traditional threats while lacking capabilities for confronting criminal organizations that operated across national boundaries and exploited cultural and political freedoms for strategic purposes. The network's success had demonstrated that democratic societies needed new approaches to security that could preserve their openness while defending against enemies who had learned to weaponize the trust and freedom that made democratic life possible. As authorities throughout Europe struggled to comprehend the full scope of the conspiracy they had uncovered, one fact became increasingly clear. The heroin havens of Parisian cafés had been far more than criminal enterprises or artistic gathering places. They had been laboratories for developing techniques of psychological warfare and social manipulation that would continue to threaten democratic civilization long after the last participant had been brought to justice and the final café had been shuttered forever. The network's legacy would extend far beyond the immediate participants in its criminal activities, influencing how democratic societies understood and defended against threats that exploited their greatest strengths as weapons for their destruction. The bohemian dreams that had drawn so many vulnerable souls into the network's web had been revealed as nightmares that threatened to consume not just individual lives, but the entire civilization that had made those dreams seem possible. In the shadowy corners of those smoke-filled rooms, where needles passed between trembling fingers and artistic ambitions dissolved into chemical dependency, a new form of warfare had been born. The battle for the soul of European civilization would continue long after the cafes fell silent, fought not with conventional weapons, but with the more insidious tools of psychological manipulation and cultural corruption that the network had perfected through years of experimentation on some of history's most vulnerable and idealistic individuals. The investigation had revealed that the true target of the network's operations had never been simply money or drugs, but something far more precious: the trust, creativity, and idealism that made democratic civilization worth preserving. Understanding how these qualities had been systematically exploited and corrupted would be essential for protecting future generations from similar threats, while maintaining the cultural freedom and social openness that remained essential for human flourishing in an increasingly complex and dangerous world. The network's collapse marked the end of one chapter in the ongoing struggle between the forces of civilization and those who would exploit human weakness for destructive purposes. But the techniques and insights that had been developed through the systematic manipulation of cafe culture would continue to influence criminal organizations and hostile governments throughout the 20th century and beyond, creating challenges that democratic societies would struggle to address while preserving the values that made their way of life worth defending. The heroin havens had been closed, their participants scattered to rehabilitation centers, prisons, or early graves. But the knowledge of human vulnerability that had been gained through their operation would live on. A dark legacy of one of history's most sophisticated attempts to weaponize art, culture, and human creativity in service of forces that sought to destroy everything those qualities were meant to celebrate and preserve. The struggle to defend democratic civilization against such threats would continue, informed by hard-won understanding of how easily human nature could be exploited by those who possess both the will and the knowledge to transform society's greatest strengths into instruments of its potential destruction. The final act of this tragic symphony began in the autumn of 1929, when the global financial collapse that would become known as the Great Depression delivered the killing blow to a network already weakened by investigation and exposure. The stock market crash of October sent shockwaves through the wealthy families whose trust funds and investments had sustained the cafe operations, while the economic chaos that followed created conditions that made the network's sophisticated financial manipulations impossible to maintain. Lady Catherine Pembroke, whose cooperation with Detective Inspector Bertrand had helped expose the network's aristocratic connections, found herself facing a different kind of devastation as her family's textile fortune evaporated, along with millions of other investments. The inheritance that had made her such an attractive target for network operators no longer existed, leaving her to confront both her addiction and her exploitation. Without the financial resources that had once seemed to guarantee her security, Catherine's recovery took place in a small clinic outside London, where she spent months learning to distinguish between the authentic relationships she was building with other patients and the manipulated connections that had defined her Paris experience. The process was complicated by her realization that some of her most treasured memories of artistic discovery and intellectual growth had been systematically manufactured by people who viewed her as nothing more than a source of revenue. The psychological damage extended far beyond simple addiction. Catherine had to reconstruct her entire understanding of art, culture, and human relationships after discovering that her most profound experiences had been orchestrated by criminals who understood exactly which emotional buttons to push to maintain her compliance. The paintings she had purchased with such pride were revealed to be worthless forgeries. But more devastating was the recognition that her emotional responses to them had been genuine. Even though the circumstances of their acquisition had been entirely false, Catherine's recovery became a model for treating other network survivors who struggled with similar challenges. Traditional approaches to addiction treatment proved inadequate for addressing the complex psychological manipulation that had characterized their experiences. These individuals needed to learn not just how to live without drugs, but how to trust their own judgment and emotional responses after years of systematic deception. The treatment approach developed for network survivors incorporated techniques that would later influence therapeutic methods for treating victims of other forms of psychological manipulation and coercive control. The recognition that addiction could be weaponized as part of broader manipulation schemes created new understanding of how criminal organizations could exploit human vulnerability for purposes that extended far beyond simple financial gain. Dr. Edmund Whitfield, a psychiatrist who worked with network survivors at a facility in Switzerland, documented patterns of psychological damage that he termed manufactured dependency syndrome. His patients had been systematically conditioned to associate their most meaningful experiences with situations controlled by their manipulators, creating forms of psychological bondage that persisted long after the physical addiction had been addressed. Dr. Whitfield's research revealed that network operators had developed sophisticated understanding of human psychology that allowed them to create artificial emotional dependencies that were often more powerful than chemical addiction. Patients who successfully overcame their drug dependencies often continued to crave the social connections and cultural experiences that had been provided through network participation, even after understanding that those connections had been deliberately manufactured for exploitative purposes. The challenge of treating manufactured dependency syndrome required therapeutic approaches that helped patients develop authentic relationships and genuine cultural interests while processing the trauma of discovering that their most cherished experiences had been systematically fabricated. The process often took years and required careful attention to preventing patients from simply replacing their network dependencies with new forms of artificial connection. Jean-Baptiste Marot's recovery exemplified both the possibilities and limitations of treatment for network survivors. His cooperation with authorities had earned him access to experimental treatment programs that combined medical intervention for his heroin addiction with psychological therapy designed to address the manipulation he had experienced. But his artistic career faced challenges that extended far beyond his personal recovery. The painting Jean-Baptiste had created while using heroin possessed qualities that critics and collectors found compelling. But his work produced during recovery lacked the otherworldly intensity that had made his addicted periods seem so artistically significant. This created a cruel dilemma. His best work had been produced under conditions that were destroying his life, while his healthiest periods produced art that seemed mundane by comparison. Jean-Baptiste's struggle with this artistic dilemma became a subject of intense debate within recovery communities and legitimate art circles. Some argued that his heroin-influenced work should be celebrated as authentic artistic expression that happened to emerge from tragic circumstances. Others contended that celebrating art produced through criminal exploitation perpetuated the romanticization of addiction and manipulation that had made network recruitment possible. The debate reflected broader questions about how society should evaluate cultural achievements that emerged from destructive or exploitative circumstances. If genuine artistic innovation had resulted from systematic criminal manipulation, how should that innovation be understood and preserved? Could the artistic value be separated from the criminal context? Or did acknowledging the art's significance somehow validate the methods used to produce it? These questions became practically urgent as legitimate galleries and collectors struggled to determine how to handle network-associated artworks that had been seized during the investigation. Some pieces possessed genuine artistic merit that had been recognized by critics who were unaware of the criminal circumstances surrounding their creation. Others were revealed to be mediocre works whose perceived value had been artificially inflated through the manipulation of buyers whose judgment had been compromised by addiction and psychological manipulation. The art market's response to network-associated works created a new category of cultural artifacts whose value was complicated by their association with criminal activity. Some collectors who had purchased works through legitimate channels found their investments worthless when the criminal connections were revealed. Others discovered that pieces they had dismissed as overpriced had actually been genuine masterworks, whose value had been obscured by the scandal surrounding their origins. Professor Helena Richter, an art historian from Vienna, who had been studying the relationship between creativity and altered consciousness, found her own research complicated by the network revelations. Her academic work had suggested that certain forms of drug use could enhance artistic creativity, but the discovery that systematic criminal exploitation had influenced many of the work she had studied forced her to reconsider her conclusions about the relationship between chemical enhancement and authentic artistic expression. Professor Rita's dilemma reflected challenges faced by scholars throughout Europe who had been studying cultural movements and artistic innovations that were later revealed to have been influenced by criminal manipulation. Academic work that had seemed to provide objective analysis of cultural phenomena was called into question when the criminal context became apparent, forcing researchers to distinguish between genuine artistic innovation and manufactured cultural significance. The academic community's response to these challenges led to new standards for research into cultural movements and artistic communities. Scholars developed techniques for identifying potential criminal influence in cultural phenomena, while academic institutions established protocols for addressing research that might have been compromised by criminal manipulation of subjects or data sources. The broader cultural impact of the network's exposure extended far beyond academic circles. The revelation that sophisticated criminal organizations could systematically exploit artistic communities created suspicion about avant-garde cultural movements and experimental artistic practices. Public support for arts funding and cultural institutions declined as taxpayers questioned whether their money might be supporting activities that could be infiltrated by criminal organizations. This cultural backlash had devastating effects on legitimate artists and cultural institutions that had no connection to network activities. Experimental theaters, avant-garde galleries, and innovative cultural programs found themselves facing reduced funding and public suspicion simply because they represented the kinds of activities that criminal organizations had learned to exploit for their own purposes. The backlash was particularly severe in Paris, where the café culture that had given the city its reputation for artistic innovation became associated with criminal exploitation and social destruction. Tourism declined as visitors who had once been attracted by Paris's bohemian atmosphere began to view the city's cultural offerings with suspicion and fear. Maurice Delas, who had owned a legitimate café near the Span that had served as a gathering place for artists and intellectuals without any connection to network activities, found his business destroyed by association with the scandal. Customers who had once appreciated his establishment's authentic bohemian atmosphere now viewed any café that attracted artists as potentially dangerous, forcing him to close a business that had operated successfully for 15 years. Maurice's experience reflected the broader damage that the network's activities had inflicted on legitimate cultural institutions and businesses throughout Paris. The systematic exploitation of café culture had created suspicion about authentic cultural activities that made it difficult for legitimate operators to maintain their businesses or attract customers who might be associated with artistic communities. The economic impact extended beyond individual businesses to affect entire neighborhoods that had been associated with artistic and intellectual culture. Property values declined in areas like Montmartre and Manus, as the romantic associations that had attracted residents and visitors were replaced by concerns about criminal activity and social danger. The neighborhood decline was accelerated by the departure of legitimate artists and intellectuals who found themselves unable to pursue their work in environments that had become associated with criminal exploitation. The authentic cultural communities that had made these areas attractive were dispersed, leaving behind empty studios and abandoned gathering places that served as monuments to the network's destructive impact. The heroin havens of 1920s Paris had finally fallen silent. But their echoes would reverberate through history for decades to come. What began as bohemian dreams in smoke-filled cafes had revealed itself as one of the most sophisticated criminal conspiracies ever to exploit human creativity and vulnerability for destructive purposes. The true tragedy wasn't just the lives lost to overdoses or the fortunes drained by systematic exploitation. It was the corruption of everything that made artistic culture worth preserving. The trust between mentor and student, the genuine search for meaning through creative expression, and the communities that should have nurtured human potential instead of destroying it. The network's collapse left a generation of survivors struggling to rebuild not just their lives, but their understanding of art, relationships, and authenticity itself. Yet from this devastation emerged crucial insights about how criminal organizations could weaponize culture, exploit vulnerability, and threaten the very foundations of democratic society. The lessons learned from these heroin havens would prove essential as the world faced new forms of psychological manipulation and social exploitation in the decades that followed. The cafes where dreams went to die had become laboratories for understanding how easily human nature could be corrupted and how vigilantly free societies must guard against those who would exploit our highest aspirations for their lowest purposes.